In the last section, we put our two reducers together inside of our reducers index.js file. I'm now going to import the Redux library into this file and wire up these reducers to each other with that combine reducers function. So at the very top, I'll do import curly braces combine reducers from Redux. Notice this is an example of a named export. So I'm making use of the curly braces here. Now I'm sure you might be curious, how do we know when to use the curly braces and when not to if we are importing code from some other library? The only answer I have for you is that you need to look at the documentation for that library. When you are importing code from your own files, you will always know by looking at the file contents if you are doing a named export or a default export, and thus whether to include or not include the curly braces. So anytime you're making use of some outside library, you have to look at the documentation and be told whether or not you need those curly braces. So now at the bottom of the file, I'm going to make use of that combine reducers function. I'll say combine reducers. I'll pass it an object. And remember, the keys of this object are going to be the keys that show up inside of our state object. So I'm going to assign a key of songs to this thing, and that's going to get my songs reducer. So I'll say songs reducer. And then I'm also going to give it a selected song key, and that's going to get my selected song reducer. Oops, selected song reducer, like so. And then finally, I'm going to do an export default in front of that thing. So now any other file inside my project can get access to our combined set of reducers. All right, so believe it or not, that is pretty much it for the strictly Redux side of things. We've got our reducers put together, and we've got our action creator, singular, put together. So from here on out, it's really just React and React Redux. That's it. That's the only code we have to write from this point on. So I'm going to close down all the files I currently have open. And then I'm going to open up the index.js file inside of my src directory. Remember, this is the one where we had imported the app component and then tried to show it on the screen. So we're now going to add a little bit more configuration to this thing than what's currently in here. Our goal is to make sure that we get that provider tag at the very top of our component hierarchy. And we need to make sure that we also pass it a reference to our Redux store that gets all of our reducers loaded up into it. So back inside of here, I'm going to import a couple of different files. First off, I'm going to import a provider component from React Redux like so. So this right here, yep, that's the provider we've been talking about. This is technically a component right here. It is a component that is made by the React Redux library. Notice how this is also a named export, and that I named it with a capital P because it is a component, and by convention, we label component variable names as capitals. Next up, I'm going to also import the create store function from Redux. This is the same function that you saw a little bit ago over on that CodePen example. We had passed create store our set of reducers, and it returned back to us a Redux store that contained all of our reducers and all of our application's data or state. And then finally, underneath my app, I'm going to import my reducers from the reducers directory like so. Now here's a great example. Notice how we've got two named exports right here, and then everything else inside the file are unnamed or default exports, so no curly braces required. So again, don't just kind of add in willy-nilly, curly braces sometimes and not curly braces other times. Really think about what you are trying to import. Now the other thing I want to mention here is you will notice that I grouped together all of my imports from outside third-party dependencies, and then I also grouped together all of my own code underneath it. I don't really need the space here. Sometimes you'll see people put a space in. I do sometimes, I don't sometimes. It doesn't really make a big difference. Okay, so now the last thing we have to do is create an instance of the provider and wrap our app component with it. So to do so, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space here. And then I'm going to wrap the app with a provider. And I'm going to fix up that comma, make sure it's at the end of provider like so. That's better. And then I'm going to pass the provider component a single prop called store. The store is going to be the result of calling createStore and passing in our reducers. So I'll call createStore, and I'll pass in our reducers like so. So back on our CodePen example, you and I got a reference to the object that was created by createStore, and then we played around with it a little bit. But when we make use of the React Redux library, we don't usually mess around with the store directly. Instead, we pass it off to this provider, and the provider essentially takes care of everything from there. So in a typical Redux application, you're actually very rarely going to interact directly with the store, outside of some more advanced cases that we'll see later on. Okay, so that's it. We've now wired up our provider, and now any component inside of our component hierarchy can implement this or make use of this connect thing right here. And remember, the purpose of the connect component is to somehow communicate with the provider that we just put together, and thus communicate with all the data inside of our Redux store. So let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to continue working on the Redux side of our application by putting together our song list component. It's a quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.